Good morning. Welcome to Westbridge Church. My name's Jeremiah. I'm one of the pastors here. It's so awesome to have you with us today. I want to say hello to everybody joining us online. Thanks for participating there. And if you have small kids you prefer to keep with you during the service, our parent viewing rooms are a great option for that. There's also viewing areas in the cafe. Hello to those of you joining us there as well. And what a fun morning. Children's Cup in Eswatini is one of our global partners. We have several global partners that we support every single month. And just this year alone, to just one of our global partners, we've given well over $25,000 to Children's Cup, to that care point for those kids. So that's because of your generosity. I never want to miss a chance to say thanks for being such a generous church. That's all through our legacy project. The goal with that we do with all of our money that comes in is we take the first 10% right off the top and we give it away to global partners. And so we've been able to, just in the last, since we've been in this building, we've given away a little over $1 million towards global partners and local initiatives, and it's just been so much fun. And all of that is just because of the collective generosity of a group of people who say, God, you've given it to me, you've entrusted it to me, and I want to use it to further your kingdom work in the world. So I just want to say thanks for being such a generous church. I couldn't do what we do without you. I want to remind you real quick, we're in a series called For the One. This is a little different series than we normally do, and the reason it's different is because we're in this season where we're looking at expanding this building, and so many of you are sitting really like without your two-seat American buffer seat right now that you can see why we need to do this. The truth is, we're going to talk a little bit about generosity today, but the reality is that's not something we talk about on every single week, but at the same time, I don't want to apologize for it because this is in the scriptures so much. Jesus talks about it so much, and so we're going to tackle that today. But I want to say this, if this is your first time, or if you're like, I'm just checking out church for the first time, or I'm just checking out the whole faith thing for the first time, and you're like, oh, there it is, I knew it, church talks about money, I knew the other shoe was going to drop, and I just want you to know you just picked a great week to be here, because I want you to see that we're going to talk about this from a perspective that doesn't use manipulation or guilt or coercion. That's not our goal. We're simply going to share with you, here's what the scriptures teach, and what you do with that is between you and God. Now, as a part of this series, we've had several Q&A meetings. If you didn't get one of these booklets, this series is called For the One, and it's got floor plans, renderings, all this stuff for our expansion of this building. And then I would really want to encourage you, if you have not been able to go to a Q&A meeting yet, we've got 5 more coming up. So tonight, Monday night, Tuesday night, Thursday night, Friday night, all right here at the building. You can come and see fly-through videos and renderings and get all your questions asked. And we would love to just walk through this with you so that you know exactly where we're going, what this is all about. So if you didn't get one of these booklets, they're in the lobby at the Next Steps area. Grab one of these and then go on the church app, the Westbridge Church app, click For the One and click on Sign Me Up for a Q&A meeting. There's a bunch of opportunities to do that, and we'd love for you to walk through that with us. Now, we're in part 2 of this series, For the One. And the reason we're calling that is because of the words of Jesus when he said, how many of you, if you had 100 sheep and one of them gets lost, wouldn't you leave the 99 on the hills and go and search for the one that is lost? And that's what we want to do. We want to be a church that is outward focused, that's reaching for the one who is far from God. And when Jesus says lost, he's not talking about a GPS coordinate on a map. He's talking about disconnected from God. And so for the last 18 years, we've been a church that would say, you know what, we're going to risk those that are on the hills and those that are currently in safety for those that are far from God, disconnected from God, and create environments that help bring them in and experience the hope and the grace that are offered in Jesus. And so as part of our mission For the One, to help people find and follow Jesus, this series is about all of us as a church family coming together to add on to this facility, to expand our building so that we can continue to be people helping people find and follow Jesus. The mission is crystal clear. We want people to experience the love of Jesus, the grace of Jesus, the hope of Jesus, begin to follow him with their life, and people are responding. And now we've come to this crossroads where it's time for us to act and move on behalf of the people from our community who have yet to experience the hope offered in Jesus and who might not have space as we continue to grow. It's going to require all of us doing our part to give generously to make that happen. So just as the mission is clear, the opportunity before us is clear. So we're setting out on this sort of endeavor. We're running out of space. So our goal is to double our spaces for kids, students, adults, and parking. So that's what will happen through this next phase of our building. And God always works through the collective efforts of his people to accomplish his purposes in the world. In 1997, there was a book published by Oliver Sacks called The Island of the Colorblind. And it's a fascinating story. Based on his research, and he would do visits to this small island called Pingelap in the Pacific Ocean. In 1775, a catastrophic typhoon swept through the island and almost completely obliterated the whole population of the island of Pingelap. Only 20 people survived. One of them was the king of Pingelap, and so they started to repopulate the island. And as they did that, it was discovered that the king carried a gene for colorblindness, and subsequent generations were born with colorblindness. It carried through from generation to generation without the ability to see the incredible beauty around them. Now think about that. They're in a tropical paradise. And yet, they have like the bluest of blue ocean and blue skies and like vibrant green jungle leaves. And they've got just, amazing orange and yellows and tropical birds and ocean sunsets. And they can't see any of it. It's all gray to them. Think about that. It's a fascinating story. And I can tell you, that's exactly what life is like for followers of Jesus who have yet to experience the joy of generosity. It's like you're living in an incredibly beautiful tropical paradise. It's all around you, and God's doing something, and he's working, and it's like everything's gray, and you miss it. So I started watching videos on YouTube this week of people who are colorblind who get the colorblind corrective lenses for the first time. And if you've never watched these videos before, look them up on YouTube and get a box of tissues next to you, all right? Because they're incredibly emotional. So I'm sitting in a Starbucks this week working on this message and just crying into my computer, I'm like looking around at people. I'm not crying, you're crying, shut up. And so I'm watching these. One is a college kid who has a whole group of friends that go, we're gonna get this for him. And they give him these lenses for his birthday. And they all are holding these different brightly colored balloons. And so he puts the glasses on and they're crying and he's crying and I'm crying. And he goes, they're not all the same. And that's his expression. He's just like, he's blown away by the fact that he thought all balloons were the same, Another one is a bride and groom, and for their first look, she gives him a pair of these glasses. And so he puts them on, and there's a barn in the distance, and he keeps taking them on and off. He's like, red, gray, red, gray, red, gray. He's like, this is what you see every day? He's just blown away. He couldn't believe it. And what I want you to see today is that generosity isn't simply about building a building. That's a byproduct. It's about helping us take a step of faith as a church family. It's about making sure that we can leverage our resources to fulfill our mission at an even greater capacity. And I got to tell you, we're not the first ones to do that. What you read about the very first followers of Jesus, you discover something about them. And it's this: followers of Jesus are marked by radical generosity. Followers of Jesus have always been marked by radical generosity. In fact, when you read the first church and you read about their interactions with one another, you discover something pretty fascinating about the interactions that the very first church had with one another. And when you read that description, it's inspiring. Listen to what it says in Acts chapter 2. All the believers met together in one place and shared everything they had. They sold their possessions and shared the money with those in need. They worshiped together at the temple each day, met in homes for the Lord's Supper, and shared their meals with great joy and generosity. It's so amazing when you read about the early church that when it started a couple thousand years ago, one of the main ways in which the rest of culture understood that these followers of Jesus, the impact it made in culture, was that they had a very different economic mindset than the rest of culture. Their economic mindset was so drastically different than the culture around it. People shared what they had. They gave things away. They seemed to be free from being trapped by their stuff. And people who lived in that culture in that day, like no one did that. You wouldn't just give something for the benefit of something for someone else without expecting something in return. No one would do that. And yet, whenever the life of the early church is described, you see this pattern over and over again. In every city where the message of Jesus goes out, this incredible generosity that's unreasonable to those who aren't followers of Jesus. People would look at this and think, we don't get this. Nobody gives money away like this without expecting something in return. Nobody is this generous. And the reason followers of Jesus were so different is because fundamentally, at its core, the message of Jesus is not a message of check these boxes and earn some kind of morality so that you're in right standing with God. It is a message of grace. It is all about what Jesus has already done for us. that he's moved in our direction. And through Jesus' death and resurrection, we can have right standing with God, not through anything we do, but because of what he's done. And that's a message of grace. And when you experience that, something changes on the inside. The message of grace is what sets you free. And so here's what we discover. Radical generosity is the result of God's grace. It isn't the result of checking some box or checking some list. It's just because God's grace has been so good to me, I want to give to others. Because God's been so generous to me, I want to be generous to others. Now here's what I can tell you. Nobody becomes a generous person through guilt. Nobody becomes a generous person through manipulation. Nobody becomes a generous person through coercion. In Luke 8, we're told Jesus and his disciples went out on a preaching tour. And accompanying them are a whole bunch of people who've experienced the grace of Jesus in their life. And it lists some of them. It says Mary Magdalene, of whom Jesus had cast out 7 demons. And then it talks about a woman named Joanna, who is the wife of Chuza, who is Herod's household manager. They had some wealth. And then it says Susanna. And then it goes on and says this, and many others who were contributing from their own resources to support Jesus and his disciples. In Acts chapter 4, we're told about a man named Barnabas who sells a field and takes the proceeds and gives it to the apostles for the work of the ministry. Throughout the centuries, God uses people to fund his work in the world, and it is always because of his grace. And the Bibles that we read today, the ones that we give away free Bibles every week to people that need a Bible, and it says Tyndale Publishing House. That's named after a guy named William Tyndale. William Tyndale was the first one to translate the Bible into English so that everyday people could read it. In fact, he did it at the cost of his own life because it was illegal at the time that he lived for people to own the scriptures for themselves and to read it for themselves. The church controlled everything, and it was all in Latin. You have to go, and the priest would read it to you, and they'd tell you what it meant. And he said, no, everybody should be able to read this for themselves. And so he translated it into English. And as a result, he was captured by the church and executed by the church. He's pretty famous in history for having done this, but the reason he was able to accomplish it was because of a guy named Humphrey Monmouth, who actually funded the entire process, who said, come to my house, I'm gonna set up a workstation for you so you can study and translate, and then when it's done, we're gonna get a printing press, and I'm gonna fund the entire thing. And the reason it was able to happen was because somebody was behind the scenes being generous with what God had given them. Another guy in history named George Whitefield, part of the Second Great Awakening in America. He traveled all across the 13 colonies and would share the message of Jesus, and he would just preach every day, and there were no big buildings, no buildings large enough to hold the people that were coming to hear him, so he'd just go in fields every day and preach. And every day, 7 days a week, he was just so passionate about this message of God's grace. In fact, in the era in which he lived, no broadcast, no radio, no internet, right? No apps. And he preached to over 10 million people in his lifetime. But the reason he was able to do it was because of a countess named Lady Huntingdon. And she took her massive fortune and she funded his travels and other pastors and missionaries. And in her lifetime gave away over half of her fortune and built 64 churches across Europe. Another guy named John Newton. John Newton was a slave trader. And he actually got rescued from the slave trade and found hope in Jesus and became a pastor of a church in England. And he started to write some hymns, and people would come from all over to hear him speak. He started to write some hymns. One of his hymns gained some traction. It's called Faith's Review and Expectation. Kind of a mouthful. We know it today as Amazing Grace. And the reason that hymn is sung in so many places across the world today is because there was another guy named John Thornton, one of the wealthiest men in Europe at the time. And John Thornton funded the publishing of his books, the publishing of his hymnals. In fact, John Thornton heard about John Newton from his nephew. His nephew was a young man who was in John Newton's church. And he'd send him money because his nephew loved going to church and was growing in his faith. And so John Thornton said, man, I want him to continue to grow in his faith. That young man's name was William Wilberforce. He would later grow up and join Parliament. At 25 years old, he would go to John Newton and say, because of my faith, I think I should be a pastor. And John Newton said, don't you dare. He said, you need to stay in Parliament. You need to work where God has put you because he strategically placed you there. And 20 years later, William Wilberforce was the one to work to abolish slavery. And John Newton told John Wilberforce, I want you to know something. Your uncle, John Thornton, is responsible for more souls coming to Jesus than anybody in this lifetime, because of the way that he used the resources God gave him to fund churches and fund missionaries and just continue to give. This is the work of God in the world. Over and over throughout history, when people encounter God's grace, it opens their eyes to the wonderful, vibrant, colorful hues of generosity. They go hand in hand. And grace is what revolutionizes people's attitudes towards money and possessions. It gives us a new relationship with our stuff. If you've experienced the grace of God in your life, it changes you. And if you haven't experienced the grace of God in your life, then when the church talks about money, it feels a little touchy. It's like, all right, maybe I'll come back next week. Like, let's do something on prayer or, relationships or something, right? And maybe you get a little emotional, or if God's grace hasn't affected you, you might get a little defensive, or maybe you get a little giddy when you save a couple dollars with a coupon. But if you have experienced the grace of God in your life, where you go, man, I'm in right standing with God, not because of anything I've done, but because of who he is and what he's done, it should impact you in this area. You begin to view money and possessions through a completely different lens. And so my question is this: have you experienced the grace of God in your life? And if you have, how has that grace changed your attitude? How has his grace changed the way you impact relationships, the way you interact with relationships? How has God's grace changed your worldview? How has God's grace changed your willingness to forgive? How has God's grace changed your parenting? How has God's grace changed you in the way that you interact in your marriage? How has God's grace changed the way that you think about things? Now, let me take that a step further and let me ask you a very measurable question. How has God's grace changed you in your giving, your generosity, the way that you handle your finances? Because all through the scriptures, there is this pattern. When someone encounters the incredibly generous grace of God, it affects their generosity. Instead of getting defensive or emotional over the idea of giving, they're energized by it because they found the words of Jesus to ring true. It is more blessed to give than to receive. Now, some of us feel stuck in this area. Some of us feel stuck maybe even spiritually in our lives, because for some of us, we've experienced the grace of God in our lives. We've said yes to his grace, but we have yet to let it impact our generosity. And so in many ways, it feels like we're colorblind. And I'm not here to make you feel guilty about that. But I do want to make you aware, and I want to call us into something that I think God wants for us, something bigger and deeper and richer. And so I think there's some things that will help us in that area. 4 questions that all of us should ask. And these are questions I got to continually ask myself on a regular basis that help me to be more generous. And if we're going to be generous people, then I think these are questions that each of us needs to wrestle with on some level. And these are valid questions. Number 1 is this: have I settled the issue of ownership? Have I settled the issue of ownership? Think about it like this: everything I own is on loan, right? I wasn't born with it, and I'm not going with it, right? But when I die, none of it goes with me. I wasn't born with it. I can't take it with me. Think about it like this: if you ever pull into a gas station, you go to fill up your car, and then you see somebody next to you, and it's like a 16-year-old, and he's filling up his $200,000 sports car, what's the first thought that pops in your mind? What a hardworking and industrious young man that is to have saved up to purchase that. That's incredible, right? No, the first thing you think is, okay, that's mom and dad's money right there. That kid doesn't own that, right? That is the same concept for us. Like, this is the most fundamental and basic teaching that you find in the scriptures when it comes to money. And if you don't get this, if you haven't wrestled the issue of ownership, you'll never manage your resources the way God asks you to. In fact, in Psalm it says this: the earth is the Lord's and everything in it. The world and all its people belong to him. Everything I own is on loan. He's the owner, and it's entrusted to me, and my job is to manage well whatever has been entrusted to me and to use it. I use it as a tool to further God's work in the world. That's the goal. So everything I own is on loan. My house, my cars, my clothes, my bank accounts, even my Taylor Swift album collection. It all belongs to God. And here's the reality. Thousands of years ago, in Deuteronomy chapter 8, Moses gives a speech that he cautions the people of Israel. Because here's our temptation, is to go, well, I'm the one waking up at 5 a.m. I pulled myself up by my bootstraps. I'm the one working hard. I'm the one saving up. It's about me. But you didn't determine that you'd be born in the United States of America in the 20th or 21st century, or whatever one you're in. I'm 20th century, 1900s. You didn't determine a lot of things, the opportunities you'd be given. You might have taken advantage of them, but in the words of Warren Buffett, we've won the ovarian lottery because of when and where we were born. And so the reality is, Moses is saying, God has blessed you, Israel, as a nation, but let me give you a caution. He says, he did all this so you would never say to yourself, I have achieved this wealth with my own strength and energy. Remember the Lord your God. He is the one who gives you the power to be successful. And we talk about the issue of ownership. We try to sometimes think about, well, how much should I give? It really all belongs to him. It's really, God, how much are you letting me keep? This all belongs to you at the end of the day. King David would say this as he writes this prayer, this dedication as they bring this offering to the Lord. And this is the thing that King David in the Old Testament, the Hebrew scriptures, he says this, wealth and honor come from you alone, for you rule over everything. He's going, God, you're the one who gives us all of this, right? Power and might are in your hand, and at your discretion people are made great and given strength. Oh, our God, we thank you and praise your glorious name. But who am I and who are my people that we could give anything to you? They're bringing this offering to God, but he's like, but really, at the end of the day, who are we that we could bring something to you? Everything we have has come from you, and we give you only what you first gave us. God, all we're doing is returning back to you. You're the owner. You've given it to us. You've entrusted it to us, and so we're going to manage that well and return it back to you as a part of our worship with gratitude and to further your work in the world. So here's the question. Have I settled that issue of ownership? And if I haven't, that's something I got to wrestle through in my own spiritual walk. Number two, how about this question? Am I practicing contentment? This is big for us. Am I practicing contentment? Make no mistake about it, contentment is a practice. Our culture is constantly making us aware of all the things that we don't have. The amount of ads that every one of us will see on a daily basis is astounding. It's absolutely amazing. And here's what happens. It literally shifts in 5 seconds from, I need that, from literally, I didn't know it existed. I didn't know it existed. Now I see it and I'm like, it's not a want, I need it. How have I gone this long without one of those in my life? I gotta have it. It's amazing how that happens. But the practice of contentment is to look at what you do have and choose to be thankful rather than chasing what you don't. Think about it like this. Who's more content? The person who has $1 million or the person who has 4 kids? The person who has 4 kids is more content because he doesn't want any more. We have 4 kids. Okay, do you know, children, I love you. Mom and dad love you. Do you know who really needs to practice contentment? And maybe you don't think like this, maybe you do. But this is how I tend to think, and my guess is we all probably can think of that one person who like, they really need to practice contentment. And I have that person in my mind, you probably do in your mind. It's always the person in the income bracket ahead of mine, above mine. I'm like, well, I'll practice contentment. When I get there, then that's when I'll practice contentment. And they should be practicing contentment, but I just got to get it a little bit more. And then I'll be in the income bracket where I can start practicing contentment. And then I get there and I go, well, it's the person in the income bracket just above me that probably needs to learn contentment. I'll get there at some point. Here's what the Apostle Paul writes to a young pastor named Timothy. Paul was a guy who traveled around the Roman Empire in the first century, started churches, and then he would write letters back to them. He leaves a young man named Timothy in charge of the church in Ephesus, which is a booming metropolitan area, a big economic center. And then he writes this letter back to Timothy and he says this, true godliness with contentment is itself great wealth. It's like, you wanna know what it means to be wealthy? It's not having a lot. It's that you live a life with God's purposes in mind and that you're content with whatever he has given you. That's a wealth that no one can take away. He says, after all, we brought nothing with us when we came into the world, and we can't take anything with us when we leave it. So if we have enough food and clothing, let us be content. It's a practice. This is a perspective on true wealth. The problem is in our culture, it's very difficult to practice contentment because our culture does an amazing job showing us what we could have and what we should have. And oftentimes, what happens in our culture is, okay, if my income increases, rather than keeping my lifestyle where it's at and using the margin to be more generous, if my income increases, I increase my lifestyle to match it. And I never have the margin to be generous. Contentment says, I'm gonna live with margin. I don't need to match my lifestyle to my income. In fact, I can live below my means so that I have margin to give out of what God has entrusted to me. Are you practicing contentment, or are you always driven to acquire more? Because if you're constantly trying to acquire more, it will impact your ability to be generous. And for some of us, we're generous in our hearts, but we're much more generous in our hearts than we have the ability to be in our checkbooks because we haven't practiced contentment. So we end up saying, man, I would love to be more generous. I want to be more generous, but I've already given away all of my money to me. Contentment says, I'm going to intentionally create some margin. I don't have to spend everything I have. I can actually build in margin and be content with what I have. And then it gives me the ability to be as generous in my checkbook as I feel in my heart. Am I practicing contentment? Number 3, have I confronted my fears? It's legitimate to have fears around this topic. I would never say to someone like this, man, when we think about giving and generosity, there's some genuine fears that we have to confront, myself included. And everyone has a threshold when it comes to giving, whether it's a dollar amount or a percentage. There are some giving levels that are effortless for others and that make us feel uncomfortable. And see, the concept of generosity is in direct conflict with the concept of self-preservation. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense to say, I'm gonna take some of the money that comes to me and give it away to others without getting anything back from it. Like, economically speaking, that doesn't make sense. It fights against self-preservation. Self-preservation says whatever comes to me must be for me to take care of me. But that's assuming that you are in charge of your own self-preservation and that God isn't watching out for you. There's a point at which I start to think if I'm too generous, it's gonna pose a threat to my own well-being. But generosity isn't about being irresponsible. God never advocates for that. Jesus never teaches that. It's about an attitude in which God's voice is louder than the soundtracks of the what-ifs in my head. Oh, what if interest rates change? What if the economy crashes? What if inflation picks up? What if I lose my job? What if I have an emergency? What if? But generosity forces us to confront our fears. And when we do that, we discover our faith in God grows. That when I give out of what God has entrusted to me, it is a declaration to my stuff that you don't own me, and I'm not dependent on you. I'm actually depending on the one who provides for me. And so I can give out of what he's entrusted to me and further his work in the world, and I can then live on the rest because it's not up to me, it's up to him. He's the one that provides and he's the one that takes care of me. And when you do that, not only do you experience the joy of generosity, but you also experience your faith begin to grow as you depend on your Heavenly Father. That's why Jesus would teach this in one of his most famous sermons, often called the Sermon on the Mount. And it's called that because it was a sermon and it was on a mount. And so there you go. And Jesus says this. He's teaching this crowd and he says, don't worry about these things, saying, what will we eat? What will we drink? What will we wear? These things dominate the thoughts of unbelievers, but your Heavenly Father already knows all your needs. You don't have to worry about the things you're worried about. God's already aware of those things. Jesus says this, seek the kingdom of God above all else and live righteously, and he'll give you everything you need. Not necessarily everything you want, but everything you need. He will provide for you. He'll take care of you. If you will face your fears, and if you'll prioritize God's work in the world, you won't live consumed by need or want or desperation. So, have I settled the issue of ownership? Am I practicing contentment on a regular basis? Have I confronted my fears? And number 4, do I have an intentional plan? Here's what happens for so many of us is we don't have a plan to do it, and so it ends up becoming just passive and spontaneous. Every once in a while, we see a video on an update from Children's Cup, and we're like, I want to be a part of a generous church. I'm going to give something that day. But it isn't a plan. And then next month, we'll show a video from another global partner and be like, oh man, that's cool. I want to be a part of that. And so we give. But there isn't a plan to be consistently generous with what God has entrusted to you. Sometimes we feel inspired when we see an opportunity for a new building. But the first century church had a deep heart change because of the grace of God. It impacted their generosity on an ongoing basis. They became intentionally generous because they recognized God's great generosity toward them. But generosity does not happen by accident. You must intentionally make the decision to make it a priority, or it simply won't happen. There's too many other things that are competing for our attention and our affection. In another letter that Paul writes to another church in the first century, this one in Corinth, another big economic center and hub, The Apostle Paul would write this to this group of people in the church in Corinth. Since you excel in so many ways, in your faith, your gifted speakers, your knowledge, your enthusiasm, and your love from us, I want you to excel also in this gracious act of giving. Paul says this is something that you can put into practice and excel in as you do this on a regular basis. In these verses in particular, Paul is writing to followers of Jesus to encourage them to let the heart change that they've experienced from God's grace show itself in their generosity. And so he says, make a plan, be intentional. And here's God's plan for generosity. Now, whenever I talk about generosity for the last 18 years, we teach on this from time to time because it's in the scriptures. Jesus had a lot to say about generosity. Jesus had a lot to say about the deceitfulness of riches and the joy of generosity. It's part of what it means to follow Jesus, is that we don't buy into the deceitfulness of riches and the deceitfulness of wealth, and instead we use what's been entrusted to us as a tool, and when we do that, to move God's kingdom forward here on earth, that we actually experience the incredibly rich joy of generosity. So every time we teach on this, I use the same phrase. Every single time. In fact, some of you have already written it in on your outline. You're like, I know this one, got the answer right, okay? But every time we teach on this, we use this phrase. Every time I teach on it, for as long as I have breath, I will use this phrase because it's so helpful. We teach it with our kids. We teach it with our students, all across the board. This is the phrase. This is the plan. Give, save, live. Give, save, live. Give, save, live. Give, save, live on the rest. Give, save, live on the rest. Give, save, live on the rest. Here's why that matters. In our culture, this is what we are taught to do. Live first. I fill this bucket first. So any money that comes to me, I just assume that it's for me. And I live my life. I pay my mortgage, pay my car payment, whatever bills I have, and then if I got some left over, then I go out to eat and I get food, I get groceries, and then I use the extra for my entertainment and for myself. And then when I've lived and I've done everything I want to do, if I have a little bit extra, then maybe I'll save some. And then after that, if I have any extra at all, I can give a little bit. I might give to a charity, I might give to my church, whatever. And God isn't saying, hey, I want you to give everything away. God's saying, I just want you to reverse the order. I want you to reverse the priority. And what I want you to do is give first and then save and then live on the rest. And then you'll experience wisdom. You'll experience peace and joy. And so God's saying, look, every time it comes to you, don't assume it's all for you. Every time it comes to you, recognize that's a tool for you to use wisely to make an impact in the world and for your faith to grow. And so what I want you to do, God says, is give first. Give back out of what I've entrusted to you. And then wisdom would suggest that you save some and then live on what is left. Don't try to match up, but rather whatever is left after you give and save, bring your income or bring your lifestyle in line with whatever is left on that last bucket. And what you're going to experience then, God says, is the joy that comes from giving, the peace that comes from saving. That's how God wants us to live. That's the plan. So, generosity is not just a means to help us accomplish our mission. Generosity is the mission, right? God is not asking us to be generous simply so that we can add onto this building and create more spaces for kids and students to experience the grace of Jesus. That's part of it. But the bigger mission is that we become generous as people. Why? Because it makes us more like Jesus. When you have a generous spirit, you don't just give resources. When you have a generous spirit, you give forgiveness when someone hurts you. When you have a generous spirit, you give compassion when others need it. When you have a generous spirit, you give your time to serve others. Having a generous spirit doesn't just change things out there for other people. It changes things in here, in our own hearts. And so I'm always going to call us to places of greater generosity because it makes us more like Jesus and because I want to be more like Jesus. And here's what we're going to do and get along the way. Not only will it change our hearts, we still get to accomplish all those other things. And God isn't just raising money, he's raising children. He wants us to trust him and be like him. I know, I believe this in my heart. At any point in time, God could snap his fingers and give us $13 million and we could build. But he wants to work through people to grow our faith in him, to grow our trust in him. So here's what that looks like just during this particular season of Westbridge Church. Again, if you're new here, if you're like, oh my gosh, this is overwhelming, I get it, I'm with you. I'm overwhelmed as well. But we want to provide clear direction through this next season so that we can continue to create spaces for people to find and follow Jesus. I'm going to make a big ask. Next weekend, we're going to wrap up this series. We didn't want this to drag on and on. So this is a 3-week series. Started last week, ending next week. And next week, we're going to ask you to make a pledge to what you could potentially give above and beyond your regular giving, because we still have to operate week to week, but over the next 3 years so that we can add on to this facility and build what we need to build to create more space for more people. And it's a 3-year commitment to say, okay, above and beyond my regular giving, I'm gonna give X amount of dollars. And the reason we do pledges is because then we can go back to the bank, architect, builders, civil engineers, all and go, all right, here's the projection, here's the timeline, let's make sure that we can afford everything. And that gives us a good projection on how well we're doing and or sort of the rate at which we can start to build. And so we're just saying, hey, could everybody help with this above and beyond so that we can build what we need to continue to be a church that is for the one. Now, if you didn't get a For the One booklet last weekend, we've got a bunch of these out there at the Next Steps. I'd encourage you to grab one. Inside, you're gonna find a gift chart that looks like this. This is just a helpful guide. We're gonna put it up on the big screen. A helpful guide that will help us go, okay, this is what that would look like as a church family if all of us did this. If 250 families said, I can give $1,500 extra above and beyond what I normally give, and that's spread out over the next 3 years. So that's $500 a year extra for the next 3 years. If 250 families did that, we would raise an additional $375,000. Some of you go, wow, that feels overwhelming. You do whatever you think God's asking you to do. Some of you go, man, I'm at a different capacity. I have more capacity than that. We need 10 families that could give $50,000 over the next 3 years, extra above and beyond. And go, okay, we have the capacity to do that, and it might stretch us, but I think it will grow our faith in God. And if 10 families gave $50,000 above and beyond over the next 3 years, spread out over 3 years, that would get us another $500,000. If there's some 35 families could do $25,000 each, that's another $875,000. And so you can see how this breaks down. This is just a tool. You might not take any of those amounts, come up with your own amount. It's a tool to help us go, okay, what could we accomplish together? Now, here's what I know. Our main goal is this: 100% participation. And all we're asking you to do is go, God, what could I do as a part of this? And whatever you feel God is asking you to do, just do that. And if every one of us who calls Westbridge Church our church home would do that, I think we'll be blown away by what God will do through our collective efforts. At the same time, I totally understand the skepticism, cynicism, fears, doubts, questions, all that. So come to a Q&A meeting and ask all those questions. But also, let me say a couple of things. Number one, we're financially healthy as a church, okay? So we wouldn't be doing this if we weren't, but you can see what's happening here in our community. We're growing like crazy, and we just know, like, this message of hope is, because of what Jesus offers, people are drawn to Jesus. So we want to keep creating space where you can invite your friends, neighbors, coworkers, family members. But we're healthy. We wouldn't be doing this if we weren't. So we've worked really hard over the last several years to always operate with margin and to practice what we preach in this area. So not only do we give 10% away every single month right off the top, and we will continue to do that. We're not going to stop doing that just for this. We're going to continue to do that. You need to know we've saved up $1 million that we can apply towards this as a church. That's because of your collective generosity and because of how we are managing well what's been entrusted to us as a leadership team. Secondly, I want you to know we're not going to do something that we're not going to lead the way on. We're not going to ask you to do something that I'm not going to personally do. So myself and my family are praying and saying, God, what can we do? And we will up our giving, and we're going to stretch ourselves, and we're going to do that over the next 3 years because we're going to lead the way. We're not going to ask you to do something that I'm not going to commit to myself. Third, I want you to know we will not use guilt or fear or manipulation. We will simply present the need and trust you to do your part. Here's what the Apostle Paul says, again, to the group in Corinth. He says this: you must each decide in your own heart how much to give. Don't give reluctantly or in response to pressure, for God loves a person who gives cheerfully. And God will generously provide all you need, and you will always have everything you need and plenty left over to share with others. For God is the one who provides seed for the farmer and then bread to eat. In the same way, he will provide and increase your resources and produce a great harvest of generosity in you. So, next week, we'll wrap up the series. My big ask is that you'd come ready to give a pledge. We're going to have a card for you to say, man, here's what I think I could do. And then together, we're going to see where God is leading us. Let me close with this story. I found this to be so impactful. I read this last week. It's actually from a blog post from 2011. Let me close with this. It's from a guy named Don Linscott. He says, I wish we didn't talk so much about money. That's a comment I hear often while working with churches to raise funds for their important purposes. And I understand that sentiment, but I hold an opposing viewpoint. In fact, I hope my church always needs money. And here's why. My son Lance was born before it became acceptable for the father to be present in the delivery room, a fact for which I've always been grateful. I waited in the hallway just outside the delivery room. At precisely 4:13 p.m., I heard the unmistakable cry of a newborn baby. Lance's first sound. The nurse emerged with a smile and said, "You have a baby boy." Only a new father can know the wonder of these words. The wonderful glow of fatherhood was soon dimmed, however, when I was asked to visit the business office in the hospital. They wanted me to pay for Lance. In fact, it seemed to me that my child might be held hostage until the hospital bill was settled. I wrote the check, paid the expenses, freed my family, and we made our escape. That check turned out to be only the first of hundreds, maybe thousands, we would write on Lance's behalf. Children are expensive. There was formula and food to buy, doctor's visits, vaccinations assaulted my banking account, diapers and toys took their toll, clothes were a constant drain, and just when he would get a good wardrobe, he would grow a smidgen, and we would have to start all over again. As Lance's age and size increased, so did the expenses. Soon it was baseball gloves, Nike shoes, and uniforms. Then he needed glasses for his eyes and braces for his teeth. And then disaster struck. Lance became a teenager. And now it was cars, electronic gadgets, and cool clothes. And then came college. Lance had always and only wanted to be an architect, and to me it seemed he would be in school until he was 42 years old. Expenses soared, tuition, books, drawing tools led the long list of essential expenditures. But of course, just like loving parents everywhere, we were happy to be able to help him, and we did all we could to support his growth and his dreams. We never thought of these expenses as sacrifice. We were mom and dad and prepared to give everything possible towards his life and dreams. And then one day, Lance died. On a bright, beautiful, and horrible Halloween day, 21-year-old Lance was buried in his church's little country cemetery. And that afternoon, I walked away from his grave, and since that day, I have never spent another nickel on Lance. That's how I learned it. Death is cheap. Death can be sustained without expense. It's living that's costly. It's growing that is expensive. Our dreams, visions, and hopes require resources. Death doesn't. That's why I'm glad my church needs money. A living, growing, thriving church will always require the continual, consistent, and conscientious financial support of its members. And that's the church I always want to belong to. Such an amazing perspective. We can stay exactly where we're at, and we're fine, and we're comfortable. But there's a whole bunch of people in our community. There are 200,000 people who live in a 20-minute drive of this church. Probably close to 80% of them, according to the studies that we've done, show about 80% are not connected to any type of a faith community, haven't experienced the hope and the love and the grace of Jesus like you and I. So let's not be comfortable. Let's do what we can do to create spaces where we can invite them to experience the love and the hope and the grace of Jesus. If you've never experienced that, you need to know. It's so simple. It isn't complex. It's just this. You and I can't get into right standing with God on our own. No matter how much good we do, it's not enough for us to be in right standing with God on our own. So God sent Jesus into this world, and through his death and resurrection, we are made right with God, not because of anything we've done, but because of who he is and what he's done for us. And then he just invites you to say yes to the invitation to follow him and be a part of his family. And if you've never said yes to that, I want to invite you to do that right now. You can just say yes by agreeing with this prayer as we close. God, please forgive my sins. Forgive me for the times I've walked away from you, and I'm so grateful you never walk away from me. So I pray, make me your son, make me your daughter, and help me to put my trust in you and to follow you as best as I know how from this moment on. And God, for every one of us, God, who call Westbridge Church our home, who are following you, I pray that you'd give us the courage to lean into some of these questions. God, to confront our fears and settle the issue of ownership, and God, to have a plan to give back out of what you've entrusted to us. And I pray that in doing that, we would come alive to the joy of generosity. And that together, as you guide us, you would also provide. And where you give us the vision, you'd give us the provision. We put our future in your hands. May everything we do point people to you. In Jesus' name, amen.